right, so let me dive in really briefly about myself to frame this. I realize getting ready for this, I'm close to that midway point in my life where the first almost half, but now still more than half of my life was in traditional finance, in regular Wall Street, investment banking, M&A. And the first part of my career, the second part, I was in equity capital markets and derivatives. And second half of my career, I shifted to about 12 years ago, thinking it would be only a one-year transition, which was a transition into the impact space. So, but obviously I've made the full commitment. I made that transition initially working in a hybrid model nonprofit that my wife and I created called Her Future Coalition that works in South Asia to prevent and help people who have suffered from human trafficking and other sexual violences. And we did that as a hybrid model because I really wanted to both approach, we both did some of these problems from a business perspective and from a nonprofit perspective. So along the way, we did several spin-offs. And towards the end of my time there, I was working on a spin-off that ran into a problem that led me right into this world of alternative structures. So the spin-off we were trying to do was a for-profit entity, appropriately capitalized by for-profit investors. But it was really unclear how we could take advantage of their capital in a world where we knew impact investors cared, but it wasn't really obvious that we could get them their money back under a traditional equity deal. We were too early to do debt. No one would have lent money to us. We didn't have any, cash flow or collateral for traditional debt investor. But equity investors usually rely on this idea that somebody else is essentially going to provide capital at a later round to buy them out. And it wasn't really obvious that we would be selling this entity or there would be a round that would lead up to an IPO or something like this. And when I started talking to other people in the universe, I realized that there was this whole community of impact investors that were also faced with this particular problem and others, and we're working together. And that's what led me to Tonic. So it was actually specifically my interest in combining my work in finance with impact that led to my interest in these structures. So if I can be of any help to you beyond this presentation, I'm more than happy to continue this conversation offline. So one quick brief introduction about Tonic for those of you who are not familiar with this. We are a global community of high net worth individuals, family offices, and foundation asset owners who are active in seeking deeper impact in all investments and in their lives. And we all, both staff and Tonic members, envision a world in which all investments honor the planet and its inhabitants. Now, at Tonic, we do this through a variety of methods. As a membership organization, you would imagine that we do quite a lot to help our members. And this is an area where this particular topic overlaps both between our membership services and our field building initiatives, in that we have quite a large group of members that faced that same investing problem that I faced as an entrepreneur, which was how to invest in things that maybe don't have an obvious exit, or maybe how to make investment in structures. We'll be talking about blended finance, how to make an investment in structures that maybe are appropriate with a little bit of philanthropic capital combined with investment capital. So there's quite a large active community member of Tonic members that are working on these issues that I'm helping. But Tonic also runs field building initiatives where we share a lot of the research and work that we're doing with the rest of the community. Falco being one of the community members that from the academic community we work with on one of our field building initiatives, the T100 project. But the project related to this one that's most relevant is called the Impact Terms Project. You can find out information on this at impactterms.org. It is essentially a Wikipedia of best practices, case studies, term sheets, and ideas that can be used for people who are trying to learn the best thing for them to do an impact transaction. It really speaks the whole gamut. We're trying to expand it to include everything from the things that foundations can do for their investing, for PRIs and whatever legal structures are appropriate for your legal jurisdiction for foundation investing, all the way through the type of new impact investing structures that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to rely on impactterms.org a lot conceptually for this presentation, because for a reason I'm going to explain in a minute, there's going to be moments where I normally would have said, hey, I'm going to go into details and maybe show you a slideshow of a specific deal or transaction. Instead, I'm going to refer you to impactterms.org if you want to get some of the specifics. And again, in a second, I'll explain why I'm doing that. This will all come together. So to set the stage here, a lot of conversation has occurred after COVID-19 about these types of investments, but they've been going on for a good probably decade or more leading up to COVID-19. And as I mentioned, I learned about this space because of my involvement in one of these alternative investment structures. But COVID-19 has created this really interesting transition point where we can look back and none of these things were designed to prevent a company from suffering through a pandemic. That wasn't the design specification for any of these ideas. But we're starting to get a lot of feedback from companies and investors that have used structures like these during COVID-19 and have had experiences of the advantages of these structures that were giving them more flexibility, easier ability to work with future investors. I'll be talking more about that as this conversation goes on. But COVID-19 largely has created this opportunity for us to look at some of the things that have been being done in this space that have been now being done for a couple of years. This is both in the impact space, where impact investors have been doing quite a bit of innovation in how we can use alternative structures to provide capital to do more impact, but it's also occurring simultaneously in the traditional investing space. For example, I'm seeing a lot of funds pop up that are doing software investments. There is whole new business models where people can, out of their garage, build a new application and not only build the application, but also prove the cost of their customer acquisition and therefore prove the profitability at a very early stage. And those entities have the same similar profits problems that you see with impact investing, where they may not be appropriate yet for a debt investment and they're really too early stage, or they're going to have to give up too much of the company for an equity investment. So we're seeing even outside of impact investing, these initiatives being used to provide capital to a variety of different spaces like in this community. And in the impact space, this is also growing enormously. A couple of years ago, an organization called the Capital Access Lab was created by Kaufman and others. And they put out an RFP saying, hey, we're interested in investing in the United States in entities that are doing investing using alternative structures to help in the United States serve entrepreneurs that don't have access to regular capital. And they got over 100 applications. So there's a very large group of communities of people that have been investing in these structures prior to COVID-19. Stay tuned. In the next week or two, we're going to be publishing a report. We've been working with Kaufman on a survey of those 100 investment entities, and we'll be publishing lessons learned from that on impact terms in a few weeks. So my point here really is that we have a really nice stage set to ask this question about where do we go next? And the title of this was, how do we get from alternative structures to normal approaches? And what I want to frame in this question is setting up the framework for, I think, a thought process that will help us get there. The world we live in right now, it's kind of unclear. Most of the time, if you went to your tax attorney or your accountant, the odds are they aren't yet familiar on this. So our goal should be to help come up with a thought process, a lexicon, and a good structure of legal options so that when you go to your accountant, they will easily know, oh yeah, sure, I know what those are. Here's how it works. And we have to help the community move through that process if we're going to make these part of a new normal. So I want to define a couple terms here. If anybody wants more specifics on these, they can go into the impactterms.org and get case studies and different examples, but I'm just going to define them enough to make the rest of the discussion maybe a little easier to follow. So first, when I talk about blended finance, and be warned, there are different organizations that will use the term differently. This is a problem with all these spaces, that terminology is still being developed. But blended finance generally means a way of mixing philanthropic capital with investing capital. It could be at different stages of the investment. It could be at the same stage of the investment. It could be different investors. It can be the same investors. There's a lot of experimentation going on in this space. Many different reasons for doing it, many whys. It might be too early stage at impact company. They might want to make it easier for them to provide capital by de-risking it, providing guarantees. And if there's lots of different examples of how that works on, again, on impactterms.org. Revenue-based finance, which I'm going to be spending more time on in this conversation than on blended finance, but I'll be touching both, is essentially a way of solving the problem what to do when debt and equity doesn't fit your needs. So instead of issuing equity, which, as I mentioned, in the problem that got me into this space, I knew that issuing equity wouldn't work for the organization that I was working at, or borrowing money, which also wasn't going to work for the organization I was working at because we didn't have collateral or cash flows to justify it. With these revenue-based finance deals, conceptually, the issuer is agreeing to take a percentage of the revenue and dedicate that to paying back the investor over time. That's the concept. There's lots of different ways to structure them. They can be structured as equity deals or debt deals, and there's all kinds of features you could add. So anything you can imagine, convertibility, all those things can be added to it. But the key concept is basically that. And it doesn't even need to be revenue. I'm using the term revenue instead of cash flow because you can define this however way you want. They're very flexible structures. What they do, as I mentioned, is they provide that very valuable flexibility so that you can create ways of providing capital to entrepreneurs that may not otherwise be able to get it using the traditional structures. They provide an exit for the investor. So there's a path that the investor knows how they're going to get their money back. But there's this one problem that we all face right now, which I want to define right up front, which is this is also like blended finance, a new thing. You may hear different terms for the same topic. Contingent payment instruments is a legal term, for example, in the United States that we use, although it's not widely known, it is the legal term. Some people might call them structured exits. Some people might call them alternative exits. There are a variety of named structures. My point is when you hear these terms, they are generally talking about the same thing. So we're at this phase right now in the development of these structures where there isn't yet a consensus on terminology. The only one I want to call out as a slight warning is the description royalty finance. It's very descriptive because it makes sense that you would get a royalty, just enter into an agreement. I think most of us understand how royalties work. Just want to warn people about it though, which is that the word royalty is often very clearly defined in your tax code, and it's fairly likely to mean something different than what you think it means when you're trying to do one of these structures. So use of the word royalty is just a quick warning out there. It helps understand the concept, but it might lead you into the wrong thinking about is from how you think about it from the point of view of taxes and structuring. All right. So
whoa, you're going fast, John. Can you go back to that slide?
Sure. Thank you, Lisa.
So quasi-equity, quasi-debt, also in that stack of your other ways of thinking about revenue-based finance.
You're actually setting me up beautifully because part of the problem is how do we think about it, right? Do we want to think about it from the tax implication, or do we want to think about it from what our intent as an investor is? And as I'm going to show you in a second, we can use the same structures whether our intent is to be a debt investor or our intent is to be an equity investor. It's actually very flexible that way.
Okay.
So you will hear terms like quasi-equity. Some people will borrow terms out of finance, like mezzanine, and use that and apply it to this. There's actually quite a lot of terminology. Did that answer your question, Lisa?
It does, and I have more questions, I'm sure, after the next two slides.
Okay, well, I know you're also calling me out on being a fast talker, so, and you're right, I am. So I will slow down, I appreciate that.
You know what you might do is after you're done with a big chunk like this, you might just pause and say, any questions? Right, anybody confused?
Let me go back. Any questions?
Where do preference shares fit in here?
So I am intentionally normally at this point, I would actually talk about all the different legal ways you could do this, because you could do these as equity structures with preference shares, et cetera. And I'm intentionally avoiding for this part of the conversation structuring it that way, because what I've found is that people get in their head these ideas. You'll see this in a second where I'm going with that. But there is no preference shares are more of a legal option that you could use, is one of the options you could use to structure a revenue-based finance deal. But if you don't mind, I'll explain in a second why I'm not explaining it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions before I move on from this part of it? Okay, I'm gonna move on. So what I'm hoping to do with this is at the end, hopefully you'll understand the answer to these questions. Why do these structures exist? What's the right way to think about them? Even if you don't log into Impact Terms and see a term sheet that works in your country, but you want to sit and talk down to your investor or entrepreneur or an attorney or tax advisor, I would like to leave you with the questions that you should ask. So sort of what are the rules that they need to follow? That's my personal goal for structuring this kind of stuff. And to do this, skipping ahead to explain why I haven't answered some of your questions so far, there's a really interesting problem with talking to this specific audience, which is that you are working in different countries. So if I had been talking just in Germany, for example, I could have brought in a German attorney and had a really good answer to your question of preference company shares that is actually correct in Germany, but I wouldn't know that that answer is correct in France or anywhere else. So I thought instead what I would do is try to work through a thought process that sort of avoids this problem. Like how are these, like a lot of times when you think of these, we get stuck first on the details, like how are they taxed? What's the legal structure? What are the legal obstacles? And if I were to do that on this call, I could do it very narrowly for some country, but that I don't think would be as helpful to you all as really talking about it more, how to think through the problem and how to ask the questions to learn the answers that are right for your country. I am going to ask a favor though, which is if you are doing one of these transactions or have found out the answers to how these questions work where you are working, please share them with us. One of the things we're trying to do at Impact Terms is to create a catalog, not just of these ideas in the United States, but also how they apply throughout the rest of the world. So breaking this down into principles, I'm going to start with the really obvious one, which is, every good deal is just a merger of interests. There's someone who needs capital and someone wants to provide it. And if that were all there was to it, this would be really simple. We could just sit down in a room and figure out what works. But of course, we know that depending on where you live in the world, you're going to have tax rules and corporate rules and other rules that are actually going to limit the choices. In many ways, those rules are what you now need to think about how to fit into if you're going to be an alternative structure. So taking a look at those rules and how to think about them, this first statement is going to be fairly obvious, that wherever you live, I'm fairly confident that I don't know your tax law, but I'm sure it exists, and the government is going to want to tax whatever it is that you do. Now, other than stating the obvious to set up the next point, this is pretty important because this is, I think, where a lot of people get stuck when they begin thinking about these topics, is they immediately move to the tax question. And one of the things I'm hoping to help you with today is finding a way of thinking of these structures that says, ask the tax question second. And hopefully you'll see why that's the case. But to walk you through the logic of why I think that's the case, I want to point out one super important thing about the government's desire to get your tax money, which is just like you as an investor, you care about not just the amount of money you get, you care about the timing. The government also cares about the time value of money, and therefore they put in place rules to protect their interests, to make sure that you don't do anything that hurts the government's interests. So I want to give you a thought experiment to explain this, and this will work through why taxes become or don't become a consideration in doing these alternative structures. So let's imagine a world where there was only one tax rate. So capital gains taxes, income taxes, dividends were all the same. So when you were talking to an investor or a investee, you don't care whether you're doing debt or equity for tax purposes. So that's not part of your consideration. But would you be allowed, where you live, to do a deal where you say, hey, investor, investee, we're going to do a deal and I'm going to give you $1 million and I'm going to pay you out over the course of 10 years. But we're just going to say between us that at the end of year 10, we're going to pay back all the interest, and we're not going to pay any interest into year 10, because that might favor you, the investor, that you don't have any, you're not getting tax on your return of principal, so you can push your taxes out to year 10. I think we all probably know that the government's not going to let you do that. The government's going to come back and say, no, you can't do that. Even though I'm not going to throw out the deal between you and the investor, the government will likely say, but I'm going to reclassify it for tax purposes and make it into something that you didn't intend it to be. I'm going to call it debt for this purpose. So this is the world this is the basic structure of the problem that when you enter into the question of taxes and how these are structured becomes part of the impediment. Now, carrying that first principle on to the next logic, even if you don't know anything about the taxes in your country and you don't know the rules of how it's going to work, or you're going to invest in a country where you have never worked before, you can take that logic and apply what I call here the bad actor test, which basically says that if this structure or this idea that you've come up with or someone has proposed to you, one of these alternative structures, can be used to either lower the amount of taxes or change the timing of taxes to the government, that because of this rule that the government cares about the time value of money, it's probably already been tried and it's probably already a rule against it. And therefore, your structure will probably already face some sort of tax consequence from somebody who's tried to use that structure to avoid taxes. So this is where taxes gets annoying. If you start thinking about it from this perspective, you can easily see someone's head getting a little blurred about, wait, I want to dive into these structures. They seem super complicated. And I'm hoping you'll get my point in a second that they don't have to be. From the point of view of blended finance, when you're blending philanthropy into investing, that also has a bad actor test that I think you can apply to this oversimplifying, but getting right to the core of whether a question is something will work or not, which is that structure using, could that be used by someone to take a tax advantage donation to make more profit? So for example, if a blended finance deal allowed you, let's say you were going to invest 200,000 euros into a company and get a 10% return, could you instead do a $100,000 donation and get a 20% return on the remaining 100,000? Would the government let you and let you get your tax donation saved? Probably not. Now, I don't know the tax laws where you live, but I'm guessing they wouldn't allow that, because that's the kind of thing that someone who doesn't care about impact could do to lower taxes. And if someone who doesn't care about lowering impact can do that, they're probably going to try to stop those of us who do care about impact from doing it as well. So that's the bad actor test for the blended finance thing. So any questions about any of that before I move on to the next section? Okay, good, because this is
well, no questions, but an interesting construct that you've teed up. Since we work in multiple countries, I'm just answering that question across a lot of geographies right now.
Oh, great. Well, then I appreciate the feedback at the end if this is helpful, because that was the struggle I had trying to figure out how to present to a group that probably does work across different geographies. So my first advice then really is to sort of, instead, if you really want to get involved in working in these kind of structures, you actually should, you can avoid a conceptual problem that's going to make it harder on you by first separating your intent from the legal structure, right? And really think about what you're trying to accomplish. Go back to that very first principle that a good deal is, a good deal between the investor and the investee, and then use that to categorize your intent, and then begin to move forward to think about the legal structure and tax structure. And I'm going to give you an example about why thinking about tax structure can lead you in the wrong direction in these cases. So let's take this hypothetical example. Now, this is a super simple revenue deal, but there's only a couple of features to it. And you don't need to read the bullet points. I'll explain it if you like. But we have two investors that are using this exact same term sheet and the exact same documents, but for different reasons and different deals. The way the deal works is the investor gives the money, and then over time, the company is paying back a percentage of their revenues, and a return multiplier. So you'll see the math in a second about how that some of it works. But that's the only factor of this deal. This is one of the really simple ways of putting it. They can get more complicated, but same structure for both these two hypothetical investors I'm going to talk about. So investor number one will be referred to as Ms. Debt. Ms. Debt has always been a debt investor. She thinks and has always thought in terms of cash flows and collateral and credit risk and the things that debt investors think of, and generally looks for debt like IRR. I put in 8% down there as an example. However, Ms. Debt has a similar problem that some of these investors run into, is that she's been investing in companies that have a lot of seasonality and maybe even some unpredictability about the timing of their revenues. She still thinks they have a lot of collateral and good cash flow projections. She likes to make it easier on the companies so that they can pay when they have money instead of having to pay when they've contracted to pay with her. And this revenue-based finance deal allows her to get her IRR, but gives the companies the flexibility to, not have to pay during the summer when, say, things are slow, but then pay her a lot more in the winter when things are high for her particular company. So I'm going to using this exact structure, Ms. Det has invested in a deal recently where she took 3% of the revenues. So the company every month is taking 3% of revenues for every quarter, and keeps paying those 3% of revenues until a total of 2 times the amount of money that Ms. Det has invested has been returned to Ms. Det. Now, Ms. Equity is an equity investor. She thinks about it completely different. She likes to think of everything about life is capital gains and long-term profits, and doesn't really care about collateral or risk, really. She's even a risk seeker. And I think you probably are familiar with the different personality types between potentially debt investors and equity investors on these issues. So she's happy to take on a lot more risk. She has also been doing revenue-based finance using exactly the same term sheet and legal structure as Ms. Det. But she's investing in these companies because of the reasons I mentioned before, where maybe they don't know what their exit's going to be, or they don't know when their revenue growth is going to occur. So they aren't really suitable for traditional equity investing. So an example of a deal she might have done, where it would be she might put in a higher percentage of revenues, so 5% in this case, and ask for a higher return multiple. But by doing changing those two variables in the formula, but not changing any other terms, other probably also picking a high revenue growth company, that Ms. Equity is thinks that she can get to that 18% IRR. So here's my thought. Both Ms. Det and Ms. Equity both used exactly the same investment structure. So is that investment structure equity or debt? I am hoping that you will realize that the answer is it's actually neither equity or debt for the purposes of intent. And that is, it is a flexible investment structure that either Ms. Det can use for debt or Ms. Equity can use for equity. And so the question of intent is potentially separate from the question of how it's taxed. And if you went to Ms. Equity and said, well, this is going to be taxed as debt, but you still get to take advantage of the equity structure, why should Ms. Equity care unless that somehow changes the financial implications of the deal? So my first argument, as I mentioned, was realizing that there's a lot of confusion in these structures where people ask questions about, well, is this a preferred stock deal, or is this a redemption deal, or is this done as a debt structure, or is this done as that? A lot of the times I have found that leading those questions first makes people think, oh, I can do it this way because my intention is to be equity, and therefore the government will do what I intended. That leads to the next box. The government isn't going to look at your intent. So if Ms. Equity lives in a world where that deal structure is determined to be debt, the government isn't going to care that she's Ms. Equity. And if Ms. Equity then goes and says, well, I'll try to get around that, and I'm going to make this a redeemable preferred stock, where instead of lending the money, I'm going to contractually obligate the company to buy back that stock using the same math. Is it likely the government that where you live is going to say, oh, okay, that's different. I can tax it differently. Now, I don't know where you live or what your tax laws are, but I think it's fairly likely that if you thought that that would happen, that because you called it a redeemable stock instead of a debt investment, that it probably won't, because it conflicts with that basic principle I was talking about before, which is if you let me, an investment banker, do that for pick in your head the company that you hate the most, like it's a tobacco company. Just because you can do this for impact, does that mean that I can do it for a tobacco company? Because if I could, I would be. That is the investment banking community at large. And the government doesn't want that to happen. So those are the combined principles that make these things a little bit more complicated than ideally they should be. But I think we as a community make them complicated because we get stuck up between this question of how they're taxed versus what our intent is. So let me pause for any questions up to this point so far.
I think the bottom line is the government gets what it wants, right?
That's correct. And well, the secret second bottom line is that don't convince yourself that because you used a different word that the government's going to read your language and go, okay, that's fine. Right, exactly. Okay, so I want to move forward one quick second.
Just one real quick thing, John, having worked in India, not only does the government get what it wants, but it changes the rules on you after you've done the deal.
Oh yeah, that's legit. It's interesting. I was going to use India as an example when I gave the rule for blended finance, because they're in the middle of changing all the rules right now on what constitutes a donation and the foreign, the FCRA rules and all that kinds of stuff. But India, the blended finance rule that I set up, which is if you can get away with not helping, if it's probably wrong if you can do something for your own personal benefit with nonprofits. As far as I can tell, doesn't apply to India. There's a rule in India where companies are required to donate money to a nonprofit, a certain percentage of their income. And I'm seeing a lot of companies create nonprofits that are basically the equivalent of McDonald's saying, hey, let's create a nonprofit to sell ourselves cheap French fries. They're benefiting from their own nonprofit. So there are countries that rule is actually quite flexible. And it's interesting you mentioned India because that's one of them.
You're talking about the corporate CSR law, and all of the corporates are circumventing it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite common. So it would be illegal in the United States for what I just said, for McDonald's to create a nonprofit to grow cheap potatoes, right? And it kind of makes sense. The idea is that why would you let McDonald's take a tax deduction to lower its operating costs? But this is why this rule is not as easy to apply. The blended finance rule is not as easy to apply as a guideline because there are countries where it seems like they're almost incentivizing companies to do that.
Well, just let me correct what I said. I said all. That's not true. Actually, there are some corporates who are circumventing that rule. Actually, Neelam Chibber, there's a concurrent webinar going on right now, and Neelam Chibber is actually from India with industry, and she's taking advantage of the CSR capital in her business model.
Oh yeah, I'm not being, I agree. There are lots of opportunities to take advantage of it, and we actually take advantage of it at her Future Coalition. But it's something to be aware of. That I was more framing it as that there are places where that rule applies very strictly, and there's places where that rule seems to apply flexibly. And I don't know for any person on this call how that rule applies where you live.
And briefly, John, there's a question from Sayuri in the chat. Maybe do you want to have a quick look at that, or Sayuri, do you want to just ask it?
Sure, give me a second. All right, so the question is an alternative structure only suitable for a lead investor who has the clout to negotiate terms? Won't it discourage other investors to come in because of legal complexities? So the answer is the current reality is that it can discourage future investors. So if the investment structure is going to be long enough lasting that it discourages future investors, that could hurt. But this is true of all investing structures. So I think we should not be super letting that be a barrier. I mean, it's a very common thing with equity where somebody comes in with a very, strict early round with a high preference share, and you don't have to know what that means for this point to make sense. And for the second round of investors to say, no, I'm not doing a deal unless you renegotiate with your first round of investors. That is essentially more a question of economic power, and how does, in that kind of economic power, the current source of money almost always has more economic power than the previous source of money. So what generally happens is when these do become a barrier, they force them to restructure in some way. And that's no different than with traditional structures. The real barrier would be that the new investor might just not understand them yet because of all these confusions I've talked about already, which is like, how are they thought about? Are they thought about as debt or equity? And one of the things that I hope as a community we can do is help working together with each other to help expand on the knowledge base so that when those future round investors come in, that maybe an angel has done a deal that they're not used to, that those future round investors will be able to go, oh, okay, this isn't a problem. I can keep working with that. And then Sarah has expanded the question, the angels are typically the first investors in pre and seed stage. Doesn't this conflict with alternative structures? If you don't mind, Sarah, I would like to leave that to a tactics conversation, perhaps at the end, so I can follow through with maybe some more of these conceptual framing conversations, and then I can get into the tactics, because I have a list of tactical stuff that I want to talk about at the end of this presentation. So just want to conclude from the previous section of slides. My point was, you should think about these first, about what you're trying to accomplish, because these are very flexible structures. And where you live, it's entirely possible that what you want to accomplish from an economic perspective is taxed differently than you're used to seeing. But that, in my opinion, shouldn't stop you from doing it, as long as the tax treatment doesn't change the cost of the structure. This also is a slight warning to make sure that you don't start first thinking about what your tax objectives are. Because if Ms. Equity in that scenario had said, well, I'm an equity investor, I'm going to do this redeemable preferred stock, that doesn't mean the government's going to agree with her. And starting from tax first often leads people to get down little paths that maybe lead to some blocks where the government has a different point of view on it than they do. So let's move on to the next point. Now, if you're going to take all this and say, and this is a big wall of stuff here, so I'll try to take this slowly. I live in country X. What are the questions that I need to know in my country to decide whether this is taxed one way or another way, or how I could structure it one way or the other way? So this list of questions is we are trying to collect not just this list of questions, but even the list of answer for this question in every country where you might be interested in investing. And over the next couple of years on impactterms.org, we're hoping to actually make it so that you can pull up a little checkbox and go, oh, I'm an investor in France investing in Uganda, and it will drop down and give you the answers. But we're not there yet, but we could use your help. So if you find out the answers to any of these questions anywhere where you work, please consider sharing them with us. But I think going through this list at this point will then help lead to the tactical conversation about what are the details that you can put together to make this puzzle work, right? So probably the most important thing that can differ enormously from country to country is something that seems pretty simple, but what are the rules for the difference between equity and a debt investment? I mean, some countries have really easy, specific, you can look it up, and somebody right out of like a middle school class on accounting would be able to tell you that's an equity deal or a debt deal. If you want, my favorite country to look at is Australia. Like if you look up their rules, it's just so simple to classify an equity versus debt deal. But then you get countries like the United States, who since the early 1970s, I believe, or late 1960s, our Congress has asked our IRS to come up with rules to clarify what equity and debt is, and they haven't gotten around to it yet, 30, 40 years later. And which sounds absurd, right? Something as important as that. So what's ended up happening in my jurisdiction, the US, is that the courts have stepped in. And then, so the rules can be different all over the place, although they're coming together. And the rules are based on what some judge decided as opposed to what a legislature carefully decided and thought out. And it would probably be no surprise to you to realize that those rules therefore are not clear. This is the first thing to start with, because now we're not talking about intent, we're talking about accounting and tax, right? And start with this in your country, figure out what the rules are, because sometimes your question becomes really simple. You don't actually have that many choices, and when you do the deal, it's going to be treated one way because the rules are very clear. In some cases, there's going to be a lot more flexibility, and then you can work with your accountants and advisors to come up with a more creative structure. Other key questions that have come up in the structuring of these ones. So can companies be contractually obligated to make redemptions or dividend payments? So let's imagine you're Ms. Equity, and you just really dislike the idea of a tax structure and you want somehow to make it an equity structure. So you do that redeemable equity thing where you enter into a contract for the company to buy back its shares over a period of time. Well, in a lot of countries, the redemptions of stock cannot be mandated by contract, or dividend payments cannot be mandated by contract. Those are decisions for the board of that company to make in each period. And that gives the companies a lot of power to stop paying you if you've chosen to try to do that kind of a structure instead of trying to do a debt structure. So the choice between equity and debt may not, that is the equity and debt legal structure, not tax structure, can be complicated by, if you get an answer to this question wrong, you might find out that your desire to make it look like an equity structure actually handicaps you because it gives more power to the company to decide simply to not pay you. Although if you're here representing a company, you might prefer that choice. A lot of companies have requirements that say retained earnings, that is profits on your books. You can only make dividends out of retained earnings, and it's taxed differently if you don't have retained earnings. That's something you need to ask about. You need to know about whether or not there's accounting differences in dividend payments if they're above retained earnings, if you live in one of those countries. So there's a list of other things here. I'm going to skip to a couple other ones. For those of you who are doing debt type structures or are thinking about it, a key question to ask your accountant is whether or not there are any usury laws that might get into the way. Usury laws are laws that limit the total interest a borrower can be forced to pay over a certain period of time. One of the possible downsides of these structures when they're done as debt is that if a company has very explosive revenue growth, for example, that periodic payment might seem as a very high interest payment and might trigger a usury law. As a practical matter, even in countries that have those usury laws, I've never seen anyone barred from doing anything for it, because really, who's suing for damages in this case? But that's between you and your attorney. But I just want to call that out there as something you should worry about. One of the super easy shortcuts that you should look at is whether there's this contingent payment instrument wording in your tax code. If that contingent payment wording is in your tax code, then that probably means there's actually a very clear rule, and you can stop arguing over whether this is equity or debt because your tax code has actually put in place some of these rules. So I've hopefully left time for some questions, but this is where I wanted to leave this as a thought process. But I want to not answer one quick observation going back to the original question, so I'll be really brief about this. One of the cool things that we've seen at Tonic, and I hope someday to actually publish a report in detail on this, is that a lot of these investors that were using these structures before, not anticipating COVID, certainly, have found that the value of the flexibility has really given their entrepreneurs the ability to survive. And that with blended finance structures, it's also provided them the option to ask important questions, which is, hey, my entrepreneur is down and out. Can I appropriately give them a donation at this period of time instead of an investment? How do I combine that into my strategy? So I will say it's too early to say because we don't really have enough data yet. But preliminarily, the lessons from COVID that we've seen on this so far have been that a significant unintended consequence, a benefit of these structures, has been that because they provided flexibility to the entrepreneur, that flexibility has helped entrepreneurs survive through COVID in ways that they would not have been able to if they were working with more rigid structures. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. If anybody wants any more specifics on term sheet or legal structure, I'll send you to impactterms.org, or I'm happy to stay on now and answer any tactical questions that you may have.